left of the screen. Click the small arrow next to audio settings and select a speaker. Some viewers get better audio when streaming, while others get better quality by phone. So if you have any audio difficulties, you may want to try a different connection method. There are several Zoom features we will use. Lines are muted, but you can pose a question at any time in the Q&A panel. Use the raise hand feature if you have a Zoom technical issue and need assistance. The support team will contact you individually via chat. Today's call is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, you can disconnect at any time. Please welcome the Director of AmeriCorps Seniors, Atalia Sergi.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the second of our Innovation for Impact issue-focused webinars. Thank you for joining us today. I hope that you were among the 700 plus participants that joined us last week for our in-depth discussion about all things COVID-19 and the new opportunities our programs have to support the ongoing vaccination efforts. We learned so much from our AmeriCorps COVID advisor and our colleagues from the CDC. This week, our focus is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's talk briefly about what that means. Diversity. While we generally think of diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender, it really encompasses a myriad of ways that people differ: age, gender identity, differing abilities, socioeconomic status, national origin, sexual orientation, education, marital status, and political perspective. We know that the administration has put a particular focus on race, giving its weight in our society. Equity includes fair treatment and equal access to opportunities for all people. It also requires that everyone is provided with what they need to succeed, which means that we need to eliminate any policy or system barriers that prevent full participation, and we need to provide additional supports where inequity has existed. Inclusion means making sure that everyone feels welcomed, respected, valued, and supported to be able to fully participate. It means going beyond giving someone a seat at the table, but making sure that their voice is heard and valued at that table. Over the past several months, you have heard numerous news stories and other stories about how President Biden has prioritized the advancement of racial equity and support for historically disenfranchised communities through the federal government. This work requires intentional and ongoing actions, including training, new ways of communicating, and potentially changing our processes and protocols. This is why we're here today. We want you to fully understand and embrace how these issues affect our volunteers and why it is important to the growth and sustainability of our programs and the role that they play in strengthening our communities. We have secured two fabulous speakers today, Dr. Miranda Ward and Lisa Simpson. But before we hear from them, I would like to introduce Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence. Congresswoman Lawrence represents Michigan's 14th congressional district that includes 16 cities in Oakland and Wayne counties, as well as a portion of Detroit and the city of Southfield. She was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in November of 2014 and has been reelected every 2 years since that time, most recently in 2020. Congresswoman Lawrence is the co-chair of the Democratic Women's Caucus, co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Black and Jewish Relations, and is second vice chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. She also happens to be the vice chair of the powerful House Appropriations Committee and serves on the Subcommittee of Labor, Health, and Human Services, the Subcommittee of Commerce, Justice, and Science, and the Subcommittee of Financial Services and General Government. And if those weren't enough responsibilities, she is also a member of the House Committee on Government Oversight and Reform, where she serves on the Subcommittee of Government Operations. With all of those committee and subcommittee assignments, she is extremely busy, as you can imagine. However, She values the service that our programs provide to communities and wanted to send this message. So join us on a video. Joining us on video is Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence.
I want to thank AmeriCorps for inviting me to speak at your seniors conference today about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know firsthand that when we include diverse voices on the decision-making tables, everyone benefits. Every single day, I'm fighting for communities that don't always have a voice. I'm doing that in my role as the co-chair of the Democratic Women's Caucus and as the vice chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. I was the first African-American and first woman to be the mayor of the great city of South Hill, Michigan. I know what it's like to be the only woman and the only African-American in the room. Against all naysayers, I kept moving forward and fighting and standing up for what was right. I want to echo what my shero, Shirley Chisholm, famously said: if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And I always have a folding chair in my car. We cannot improve the lives of women, people of color, the LGBTQ community, and others if we don't listen first. The Biden administration know that, and they have been committed to elevating all of our voices. With Kamala Harris as our first woman, first African-American, and the first Asian Pacific vice president, and a cabinet that is half led by women, this administration is making sure that diverse voices are being heard and also helping to lead our country. Furthermore, I'm working closely with the Biden-Harris administration to make sure we achieve our racial justice in the communities and our communities that we deserve. Now, for us to do that, we must pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act to bring about much needed change for our policing system. And getting the Paycheck Fairness Act signed into law to finally close the wage gap for women and people of color. While Congress is working to bring reform on the federal level, change can happen locally as well. And it all starts with us, with you, with us working together. Bringing diverse communities together in the name of service will fuel the grassroots support President Biden needs to achieve real change. The work you're doing is so important to our community. It's people like you who are going to make the real difference in our community. I want to say continue to challenge the status quo, lift up each other, and support the voice of the people you are helping. Listen, understand, sometimes forgive, other times ask for forgiveness. All of these are part of building a strong team of diverse voices. I want to thank you, grantees and volunteers, for all that you do with the AmeriCorps seniors and for your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want everyone to know that when we all work together and when we make policy and we make laws that protect, remove barriers, and lift all ships, that is America. That's the American dream. And that is one nation under God. Thank you.
On behalf of AmeriCorps seniors, I want to thank Congresswoman Lawrence and her staff for bringing this message to us today. Congresswoman Lawrence spoke about listening and understanding, followed by actions. And so today, this is our opportunity to listen, to learn, and then in your breakout sessions, talk about some actions that you can take. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today. We were in search of an expert, and she came highly recommended by a former member of our AmeriCorps leadership team. Dr. Miranda Ward is an associate professor in the Department of Clinical Research and Leadership at George Washington University and the Emerging Scholars in Anti-Racism and Health Equity in the George Washington School of Medicine and Health Sciences. In this role, she designs, evaluates, and teaches health equity curriculum to undergraduate students and integrates her Equity Matters podcast. She also serves as the ambassador program lead for the George Washington Health Careers Opportunity Program, where she ensures that students from underrepresented backgrounds are fully supported and introduced to a range of health professions and the social, technical, and professional skills necessary to be successful. She is also an affiliate faculty member for the university's Honey Nashman Center for Civic Engagement and Public Service, and has a strong commitment to equity and community legacy. She describes herself as a community educator, curriculum developer, and youth builder, and is with us today to share why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to us as we serve in communities. I'm excited to hear from her, and I encourage you to visit our event website to learn more about her and her work. If you have questions for Dr. Ward as we go along, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat, and we will get to them after she speaks. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Miranda Ward.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone see my slides? Slides? I'll take that as a yes. Okay, so I certainly appreciate the invitation to come and talk with you today about what I refer to as JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, because these are the values that are a part of, your work and significant to your work in the AmeriCorps program. So I was told that I have 30 minutes, but it looks like we might have a little less time. So I'm just gonna go ahead and jump right on in. So I do actually want to start us off with what is called a land acknowledgement. So you may be very familiar with this, you may not, but I do believe that land acknowledgements are a decolonizing practice that really needs to be a part of all gatherings, including virtual meetings. And depending on your location, you may be aware of or even acknowledge the indigenous groups that are native to the land that you're currently on. So feel free to add that to the chat now. Otherwise, you can research the first peoples of the land that you're on at your leisure. But I'm actually physically located in Washington, D.C., and these are the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank tribe. And there's no longer any living members of the Nacotchtank tribe. They've since all joined the Piscataway tribe, but historians do refer to them as the Anacostans. And this is important to recognize this because it is these indigenous people who tended to this very land, right? They sowed into this land, they cultivated this land, only to be forcibly removed. So out of respect for, that history of land ownership and the right to land ownership, I'm calling that memory into this space. So who am I, right? I know you just, heard my bio, you have access to my formal bio, but I'd like to give an overview of who I am, not merely what I do, so you can clearly see the worldviews that I'm actually bringing to today's discussion. I'll actually start by saying that, because I'm always, into a good read. So one of the books that I really appreciate reading is Isabel Wickerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, because it really helped me historicize my own family's migration from the South to the West. I was actually born and raised in Southern California, despite my parents actually being New Orleans Creole and from rural Arkansas. I grew up in the 90s, so I was always very well aware of the whole light skin, dark skin comparisons throughout the media and within my family. And I was constantly reminded of my race as one of the few Black students in a largely Mexican school and Mexican neighborhood. And then there was the Rodney King beating and the riot that ensued after that. And so basically I learned informally about the meanings of race and what racism looked like as I saw that, right? And as I, saw and experienced or, witnessed rather family members who were involved in gangs or, being arrested. And I sat and watched TV and movies with friends. So it was never really discussed formally. When I say it and saying, race and the concept of racism wasn't actually discussed in formal ways in school or even in the program that I was involved in at the Boys and Girls Club. But if I were to fast forward time, I now, manage and run programs focused on social justice with DCU that fully brings in their racial and community identities. And it's just so serendipitous how I now administer pipeline programs as a proud product of one myself. So what I didn't know until later was that my high school was under-resourced and, really couldn't prepare me for the college level study skills or test taking ability that I needed. And so I was carrying that around as personal failings until I was introduced to the language around inequity. And now I ensure, as was read in my bio, that first generation health professional students that I mentor know what I didn't know. And they're primed for how to navigate terrain that really was not designed with them in mind. So that's why I teach and design, curriculum and administer programs in the capacity that I do. And I'm really excited that I get to translate my research interest in preparing the health workforce to address the challenges of both health and racial equity. So I am also a proud dog mom. So I'm raising an activist pup that does come with me to every local, protest and demonstration. And so here we are, right? A year after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and we're currently experiencing a national reckoning with racism in unprecedented and long overdue ways. And so many of our institutions, would never have even talked about race or racism, let alone anti-racism, and now are taking up these discussions to make that, what was unseen, seen, especially as we start to revisit our organizational and our institutional values around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when we do that, though, we're recognizing that there are many socially disadvantaged groups who are vulnerable to poor outcomes. And those outcomes can be due to discrimination, harassment, and obviously violations to human rights. So to be clear, the disadvantage that any of these groups that you see on the screen that are experiencing, they're not naturally occurring, right? They're all structurally engineered because of the made up, socially constructed meanings that has been attached to their identities that basically are, unfairly structuring opportunity for some at the expense of others. So I basically took the liberty of color coding them so you can see some of the cross-cutting themes that cut across these groups, right? So as you can see here, those that I've highlighted in the red, they're all dependents, right? People, that are elderly, people who are not health literate, that are children or minors. And so having no say over what you eat, where you live, or any other, all decisions basically are made on your behalf, this does become a source of social disadvantage because power comes with choice, right? So similarly, those in the purple, they're actually experiencing social disadvantage from being disenfranchised. Those in the green are stigmatized. Those in the blue are overlooked and, not counted in many ways, silenced. And so while we talk about, things like housing policy or food security or even voter suppression, we also need to look into our own organizations and programs for how our internal policies and norms and cultures reinforce the same systems of disadvantage. And I also want to just take a minute to note that I was intentional of using people first language, right? Instead of saying the homeless person, right? I want to say a person who is experiencing homelessness, right? We want to humanize people and then, separate the condition from the people or the populations that experience it. So there's a reason that the federal government does not rely on a medical definition of disability, but instead a legal one. And it's because of that disadvantage I was just talking about, right? The disadvantage that people who are differently abled or disabled experience is not merely a biological or psychological one, it's social, right? They're denied access, opportunities, rights. So it must be treated as the social ill that it is on humanity and injustice. So now I want to have some engagement. And so I realized that, again, this is still anonymous. So, feel free to participate. You don't have to, no pressure, or you can just add to the chat. But for those of you willing to pull out your phone and join this anonymous poll. In the to field of your phone, where you would normally have the person's name, you would type in the code 37607. That's going to give you access to the poll. And in the body of the text, where you would normally type your message, you're going to type my first and last name, Miranda Ward 458. And that's going to give you access to the poll. We have 2 questions. So I'm going to start with the first question, which is an open-ended, question. So I'm going to take a little minute just to make sure you get access to the poll. And again, if you want to just add it to the chat, you can do that too. So ultimately, as some of you are joining the poll, I just want to, I've laid the foundation of what, what's naturally occurring, what's not, how we really have attached these unfair meetings to these differences. And now I really just want to know what you think and what you know. So we're going to start off with this question here. So what word, one word, or it could be 2 words, come to mind for you when you think of, or you read about, or you see the word diversity? So you can just type the word directly into the text, and then it'll show up here. Yes. Oh, we see different, as like many of you are noticing differences. So that's why that one's bolded. That's how the word cloud works. Many differences, different. Okay, but I see multitude, invitation, setting, unique, and then you start to name out whether it's setting or skin or difference. Yes, it's so rich. Thank you for that. Yes, complex. Yes, absolutely. Abilities, strength. Absolutely, rainbow. I love it. Right, we're naming some of the very specific differences, but then now we're also starting to interpret what do these differences even mean. So thank you for participating in that. So you rightly noted, as you can see, the words that kind of bubbled up to being the biggest words are the ones that many of you agreed on, which is a focus on difference, right? So, whether that's social identities that some of you named, right? Geographic identities, social economic backgrounds, you want to consider the varied experiences of the core members that's on your team, your staff, the community that you're entering. So just to be clear, it's important to recognize these differences as opposed to wanting to think of people as the same, because people are not the same, right? So we do want to identify, validate, and even appreciate those differences. And when it comes to diversity, we're likely used to talking about, and counting up the number of different social identities, right? How many Black, Indigenous people of color do we have? Or let's look and assess for gender or cultural differences. So yes, the differences in social identities are most certainly important, because these varied backgrounds bring with them varied perspectives, right? From all over the world, range of languages spoken, worshiping in a range of different ways. And with that, you're going to have different views and different values that are not just the Eurocentric or the Westernized ones, right? We live in an increasingly global society, and our organizational cultures should very much reflect that. So valuing diversity is not just a mission statement or a vision statement. It has to be actualized. And there are so many ways to do just that. So as you can see here, Brandy tweets, thank you so much for your Black Lives Matter graphic, but may I please see a picture of your executive leadership team and your company board? So what she's getting at is, when we value diversity, we see it in who's hired and who's recruited and who's promoted, right? But this also comes through in your professional development, in your training, in your programming. Who are you reading and citing and quoting and publishing? Does that include people of color? Does that include young people, international or indigenous scholars, right? Who's being recruited to actually review and design your program and its curriculum, or who's actually teaching it, what is being taught, right? So diversity is not limited to who's enrolling in our programs or who's, staffing our programs, but also who are we holding up as authorities on knowledge and innovation, We want compassionate core members and personnel, right, who exercise both civility and empathy. So exposing them to varied identities and perspectives is one way to do just that. So this is our final poll. And now that we had the conversation around diversity, I want to know if you believe that once you have diversity, you're naturally going to have an inclusive environment. Okay, so if you believe it's true, you can type A. You believe that's false, you can type B. If you don't know, you never really thought about it before, or you can see both sides, then you can type in C. Yes, this is a great crowd. You get you are on it. Absolutely. Okay. All right. So just because we recruit and hire diverse core members and diverse staff members does not, as many of you noted, that doesn't automatically translate into feeling safe and welcomed and included or valued when they do get into your programs. So we have to be deliberate with who's on our websites, who's in the photos that we're framing in the hallways, who's included and how are we talking about, the different communities that we're engaging in and the examples that we, give in trainings. And again, since I teach undergrads, I'm always concerned with issues of development, on a lifespan perspective. So inclusion is also concerned with, who your core members are now while working on who they will become in the future. And so when we talk about inclusion, we have to talk about privilege. We often think of privilege as white privilege. And yes, white privilege is the thing, right? White people in this country have historically had opportunities, protections, benefits, and head starts solely on the basis of being white. And privilege is not limited to being racialized alone, right? These protections and these benefits also extend to other identities. So for instance, if I were to ask you, what do all of these social identities have in common? Being American or English speaking or man or male, being older. What do all these have in common? You really could describe these as dominant identities. These are the identities that our society, US society, was designed for, and whose experiences, values, and interests are privileged. So this becomes the dominant culture that operates as the norm, as the standard. So if these are the identities who experience rights, power, privilege, prestige, what do we call all other identities? Well, we know what we call them because we use the descriptors all the time. We call them socially disadvantaged, like we just talked about, those groups of social disadvantage, because these are the identities that have the social advantage. We call them marginalized, right? Those are the identities and the groups that are on the margins, because these are the identities in the groups that are centered. We call them underrepresented, right? Because these are the ones that are hyper visible. We also rightfully refer to them as historically oppressed. And it's because these are the other identities that are not included here, they become othered. They're targets of oppression. And these forms of oppression, again, is not limited to racism, very much includes sexism, heteronormativity, right? This idea that being heterosexual is the norm and expectation, xenophobia, racism, and just countless other forms of generational trauma and even daily microaggressions. Now, let me just say, given the intersectional nature, meaning, we have multiply simultaneous identities. No one of us have just one identity, right? A racial identity alone, a gender identity alone. We have multiple identities at the same time. That's the intersectional nature of identities. Because of that, privilege is going to operate differently, depending on which of the identities you have and which of the other identities you have. But when we start to think about, well, how are all of the hierarchies and the values and the differences and the inequity getting disguised here? It's through cultural values that everyone accepts, whether you have a privilege or not. It becomes unquestioned norms and expectations that really govern how we interact and behave. And like I said, in this country, that is a Eurocentric norm, a westernized norm, a capitalist norm, and a patriarchal norm. So these are the norms that really prevent those with non-dominant identities, or what we call othered identities, from feeling welcomed. So that is why we have to work on creating inclusive environments, and it just does not happen haphazardly. So to provide some context, as an educator, I do rely on the work of Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's more widely known for her best-selling book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? But it was her work on the complexity of identity where she did this exercise where she asked her students, who am I, right? Like, you know, to like really answer that question. She gives them a prompt, an I am blank, for them to fill in that blank and respond. And one of the things that she writes about is how every single time when she asks her students and, you know, to kind of describe who they are, and their students are actually members of dominant or advantaged social groups, they don't even bring that up when they're describing themselves, right? So, you know, if a student is heterosexual or American or a native English speaker, but you're asking them, okay, so, you know, tell us who you are. They're never going to lead with those identities. They're never going to say, okay, so I am able-bodied, I am white. That's not, they're never going to bring those up. And so Dr. Tatum describes, you know, well, what actually explains why you're not, you know, naming these particular identities, even though you hold them. And it's because those are the identities that are the norm for humanity. So it goes without comment. So it's that element of their identity that really becomes taken for granted because it's as if it's not even worth explaining. But this also means that, you know, those who have those identities are going to remain uncritical of the unearned privilege and power that's attached to these unexplored identities. So, you know, the identities that students actually do mention when they're asked, okay, tell us who you are, they always mention their othered identities, right? The ones that are targeted. And so these are identities that make all of us, because we all have these forms of identities, they make us stand apart. You know, we embed in our memory some form of difference that we've been categorized for and are often asked to explain or account for or defend in some way. So the thing is that we all have both identities, right? We experience privilege from the dominant identities that we have and a sense of power from both identities, obviously differently, but nonetheless, there's power attached to both types of identities. But this is why I started today's discussion with who I am. And later I'm going to ask for you to consider doing the same at some later point, because it really does shape how we see and navigate the world and how we really give meaning to our experiences, whether that's at home, at the doctor's office, in the field, traveling the world, or even serving in different communities as core members. So ultimately, when we're looking at what inclusion looks like, what we're really asking is, what does it feel like to be different, right? So you may be wondering, well, why do we have to ask that question? Again, because all of our institutions have been historically designed with old, white, wealthy men in mind. So if you don't hold those identities, you very well are going to feel other, especially when you don't see yourself reflected back in the leadership or in the curriculum or in the program values. And so here I just, listed a couple of ways that we can be intentional with creating inclusive work cultures and program policies. So yes, of course, we've had an opportunity to kind of talk about diversity and inclusion, but, it doesn't stop there because we haven't even addressed power. And we can't really talk about these large macro issues around racism and gender oppression without talking about power. So equity is what allows us to actually address power and determining how power is distributed and who's getting promoted, who's making those executive decisions, what our community partnerships look like. And so even if we were to, introduce the conversations around equity, we still can't stop there. Which is why I said, I describe these values as Jedi, because I'm also going to include the concept of justice, right? Because there's ongoing threats to justice. And so, now that we've had an opportunity to talk about, diversity and inclusion, to help us think about equity and justice, first of all of these are very value-laden, but especially when you start talking about equity and justice, this most certainly requires some reflection. And so I've listed some questions here that I invite each of you to, at some point, really kind of think through. And again, you can swap out, after you thought about, your experiences with race and racism, you can also swap that out and, put in a range of other social identities and forms of oppression. But ultimately, thinking about this, that third bullet, not if your biography is going to show up in your work, but most certainly it is, right? So the question is, how is it showing up? And how am I weaponizing the privilege that I have by redistributing power? Okay. So ultimately, you really can't engage in this type of work around equity and justice without being introspective about the worldviews and the values and the biases that we all have. And so it's going to show up in how your interpersonal communication with members of your team and your leadership style and your hiring practices and your grant and fundraising efforts and the event investments that you make, basically everything. And so, we have to really think about what is fair to your core members and your staff, right? So I work in an academic setting and pipeline programming. So I'm always thinking about, how we allocate scholarships, but more importantly, how do we talk about those who receive scholarships, right? What is the language we're using to describe them? We're using words like at risk and other kind of coded language, right? The stories that we tell shape the way we think about, our teams, our students, our core members, and the communities that they come from, especially when they're from historically disinvested neighborhoods. And this includes how we talk about and treat those who are differently abled or disabled in our programs. So again, without attending to this kind of in a very deliberate way, we very well could stigmatize and even further marginalize our staff and, like your core members. And this is never about intent, right? This is about impact. So you can be very well intended, but if you're not, very deliberate in your discussions of what equity looks like, then the impact is what you may very well be at, really advancing inequities in ways that are unintended. And so, like I said, equity is really not about treating everyone the same, because they're not the same, but they should have the same opportunities, right? Professionally, socially, financially, which means that we really need to work to remove barriers to give them this fair chance. So we really can't talk about fairness without talking about the redistribution of resources and power. So again, here I just listed some examples of, what you can consider, right? So, you'll notice that this includes things like having university community partnerships that aren't one-sided and only working in your favor, and keeping communities on the receiving end of service, but also highlighting and expanding their inherent strengths and their assets. Like, going back to the word cloud that we saw earlier, someone put in the word strengths, right? So really thinking about asset-based community development. And then also, without getting into like a textbook or a legal definition of justice, it is broadly focused on restoring humanity and the right to ethical treatment. So, again, this is by no means an exhaustive list of what justice looks like, but just a short list of examples of what it could look like in our programs. So actually talking about xenophobia or racism, for example, in your meetings, in your PDs, is a good start. And this is especially validating for students who experience these threats, to know that these are concerns that are prioritized in how we train to enter these very communities who are also very much likely affected. But this also means that we need to start tracking our outcomes, right? If we aren't already. So, on the core members that are in our programs who are from historically underrepresented groups in our programs. So this is just, and this is not just to focus on blind spots, but also to focus on and document and share what we very well may be doing well to combat inequity. So, and this can be a whole conversation on what this can look like. And I really do like the racial equity impact assessment tool that Race Forward. They work with, a range of city and local and state governments. And they have a tool that has actually lists questions that, that you can consider. And I know the DC City Council just adopted this, racial equity assessment, so that anytime they make a funding decision, they are always thinking about, is this going to advance, racial equity, or is it actually going to, further racial inequity, right? So they use that to inform all decisions that are being made at the council level. Questions like, okay, what racial ethnic groups are currently most advantaged or disadvantaged? And again, this is not based off of assumptions. What qualitative or quantitative evidence exists or is missing that I need to actually answer this question? So again, that's what I'm saying. It goes back to, you really have to be methodical about tracking these outcomes in ways that really lend itself to you being very intentional and deliberate about the work that you're engaged in. So I'll end here. So, all of the things that we've been talking about, right, from justice to equity to diversity and inclusion, this work is incredibly challenging, right? It's time-consuming work, right? Because obviously we have to disrupt the norms and the processes that we're used to and comfortable with. You might very well find yourself having challenging conversations, especially with people who want to play what I call the oppression Olympics, right? The my life is hard too kind of people. And this requires that you read and educate yourself on the very concepts that, we just touched the surface of, instead of expecting, those who are already on the receiving end of ongoing and contemporary trauma to educate you and take on that labor, that unpaid labor in many ways. And so again, you need to, be very clear and around how intersectionality and power and privilege operate. And this is ongoing. This is not, you not just reading one book and I've mastered it. This is an ongoing lifelong commitment to learning and in many ways unlearning. And so I will say that, you very well are going to get things wrong as you learn and as you grow. And I know that we live in a cancel culture, right? That really doesn't extend grace for people to make mistakes or learn from their mistakes. So that, that allows for some people to really walk on eggshells or decide just to do nothing at all out of self-preservation or trying to be PC. But I'm going to admonish us and invite us to forge ahead anyway. So I really do look forward to the discussion that's going to happen in the breakouts. And here's my contact information. This is just a picture of the youth in my community-based pipelining program. I want to give a little shout out to them. But here's my website, contact information. So I look forward to, again, like I said, the conversation that'll come from this.
Thank you, Dr. Ward, for giving us a full and comprehensive look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, and bringing all those aspects to our conscious mind, and helping us make sure we are deeply exploring diversity, equity, and inclusion in all areas of our programs and volunteer activities. And thank you for adding justice to our vocabulary as well. That's an area that we can explore more and have the opportunity to dig more deeply in the discussions this afternoon. Due to the time and wanting to make sure that we don't keep everyone past the time that we asked them for, we are going to collect all of the questions that you all put in the Q&A, and we will make sure to go through those and reach out to Dr. Ward to make sure that we get answers back to you. So thank you again, Dr. Ward. Our next speaker is going to share some insights from the volunteer lens. Lisa Simpson is the Senior Advisor of Strategy and Relationships in the Office of Volunteer Engagement at AARP. At AARP, she is the primary point of contact for all functions related to volunteer engagement, integration goals. She has an extensive background in operations, process development, project management, and relationship management. In addition to her strategic expertise, Lisa is responsible for leading and advancing AARP's enterprise-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy for AARP volunteers. Recently, Jan Newsom from my staff heard Lisa speak about how volunteerism can reinforce patterns of power and privilege. But when well-designed, programs can be a part of ending racial inequity and social justice and social injustice. Jan thought you would want to hear from Lisa as she shares her thoughts on equity and volunteerism and some of the resources that AARP is developing to counteract negative impacts on volunteers and communities. Again, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A and we will make sure that Lisa receives them and that we get answers back to you. So right now, I'm going to turn things over to Lisa.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking AmeriCorps seniors for the invitation to be a part of your Innovation for Impact convening. I'm honored that I was asked to speak to you today about inclusive volunteering, and I really thank Jan for reaching out to me regarding this opportunity. Let me begin by sharing a bit about my background and the first time I gave my time and talent to support an organization. In essence, really how I got involved and how my lived experiences have influenced my work and my ability to design inclusive programs. My relationship with service began in my family, specifically with my church. So it always felt familiar. It was like a place where I belonged and that I was doing good work with my extended family. I think it's important for me to start with that glimpse into my lived experiences to fully for you to fully understand how they've influenced my work in this area. You know, I'm a product of the Deep South. My parents were born and raised in a red state. My mother is from Montgomery, Alabama. My dad was from Birmingham, Alabama. So they were smack dab in the heart of the civil rights movement. And my family fought injustices every day. And I grew up hearing about segregation, about racism, inequality, social injustices, while at the same time being exposed to strong will, independence, empathy, giving, and courage. And as I shared a minute ago, I wasn't introduced or invited to service. I was indoctrinated into service through the beliefs and values my family held, particularly my grandmother. Giving back wasn't something we chose, it was automatic. It was just simply a way of life. And as a matter of fact, I don't know that the actions I was taking, I don't think I knew that the actions I was taking was volunteering. I didn't realize that until middle school. As I got older, I realized that the action I was taking was volunteering. And I began to pay close attention to the operational aspects of volunteer engagement, but specifically as it relates to equity and inclusiveness. So I know we just heard from Miranda, and I'm sure that every day, especially in today's world, we hear about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are words that we hear each day. And so in a world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are many different views on what these words mean. In some cases, there can even be a sense of confusion associated with the words. So I will invite you, I was going to invite you to tell me what you thought they meant, but since Miranda, did that exercise when she spoke, I will not do that. For today's conversation, I will, however, just share definitions with you that I will be using for this conversation. When I think of diversity, I think about the unique differences among people based on a number of dimensions such as age, race, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera, and the intersectionality of those differences, underscoring the fact that individuals are different from each other. With equity, I think about providing whatever it takes so that everyone has the ability to take advantage of the same opportunities. Inclusion is the achievement of a work environment in which all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully and have equal access to authority, opportunities, and resources, and can contribute fully to the organization's success. This is done with a spirit of embracing, understanding, and incorporating differences. So at the end of the day, you may say, well, what's the ultimate goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I would just want to take a quick moment just to pause and ask you to put, when you think about the answer to that question, in just a couple of words, place in chat what you think that is. What is the ultimate goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I'll just give you a moment to put some information in chat that you may be thinking when you think about that question. You can just put 1, 2, 3 words, just something that you think about when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, well, seeing nothing in chat for now, I will just continue on in the interest of time. So the goal for me is belonging. And here's how I define belonging. Belonging is the feeling of security, support, and welcome participation when there is a sense of acceptance, inclusion, and identity for a member of a certain group or place. We want every volunteer to feel a great sense of belonging. And we want this because belonging is key to getting people to give their best. The way to get to belonging is to have equity in volunteering. And so how might you define that in a very clear and concise way? And so I'm going to ask our technical people, if they can just pull up the slide at this point. So we'll just give a moment for that visual to appear. I could just have the slide that, oh, the slide is up. I can't see the slide. I'm sorry. I don't know why I can't see the slide. Thank you for telling me that it's up because I can't see it. So when you look at the pictures that are in the slide, I want you to think about which one depicts equity and why. And you look at these pictures and you'll see on the side on the left, everyone receives the same brown box. That represents the opportunity to provide equal treatment of people. However, the larger goal isn't achieved, which is really helping all three of these fans have a clear view of the game. So the difference that we see in the frame that's on the right is that each person got exactly what they needed in order to see the game. So each person's unique needs were considered. So what is equity? Well, equity is both seeing and then filling the gaps that are limiting your volunteers from succeeding or fully enjoying the benefits that your organization provides. And equity involves caring enough about the uniqueness of a person and the uniqueness of their issues. And so as AmeriCorps senior directors who are responsible for the recruitment, the management, and the training of volunteers, I encourage you to continue to do that, to really, realize it might involve improving certain skills that you have. It may even involve the potential diverse volunteers to receive some grace because they may have made a mistake or done something different or had a lack of certain knowledge. But more specifically, your goal is really to ensure that everyone receives the equity that they need, even though it may be different than you or from other volunteers that you have recruited traditionally. So thank you for showing that slide, and you can take that down at this point, and I will continue. So let me just talk a little bit about considerations and just action planning. Equity, as I said, exists when a person, a group, or an organization has provided all of its people with whatever it takes to ensure that everyone has the ability to take advantage of the same opportunities and also to provide all people with fair opportunities to attain their full potential. So in the volunteering space, we must be mindful of our recruitment, our training, our onboarding, and recognition practices. We must create safe places and safe spaces. I think you have really to lead with a focus on equity to get to true inclusiveness, and core values such as respect, fairness, and trust must be present along with equal access and equal opportunities. So there are a few things that I would like for you all to consider just in terms of your action planning for yourself and for your organization, excuse me. Review your recruitment and your promotional material. And I would ask you to do that with a lens of, looking at the language and the images that you are using to describe your volunteer engagement opportunities. Are you using words or language or images that create barriers for people or that, could be considered a challenge? I would also encourage you not to use what I call deficient-based language to describe communities that you are working in or partnering with. And that would be language that's focused on what they're missing. Instead, focus on empowerment and what that community has to offer and how your organization can partner with them to achieve a shared goal. So really taking the time to review your recruitment and promotional material, and the images and the language and the words is key. I also would say that you need to engage your community members as volunteers and partners to solve the issues. So this isn't about you just kind of going in and doing something and then leaving and never being seen again. Really make sure that you are involving individuals into all aspects from the beginning. Planning, decision-making, everything that it takes. I would encourage you also to think about the motivators to volunteering. And I think it's important that you keep in mind that people volunteer for their own needs and not necessarily yours. So I would encourage you to start where people are and then help them move ahead. The other point is provide culturally appropriate programming and to make sure that everyone is provided with what they need to succeed as an AmeriCorps volunteer. And so sometimes that may mean that some of your programming has to be fashioned or designed in a non-traditional way. So if you have a recruitment event or a recruitment fair or a training, you may have to change it from a daytime recruitment training to an evening. And if it is in the evening, make sure that you consider providing reimbursement for transportation or, having it, as I said, in the evening after hours. And if you do that, maybe you could provide childcare for those who are attending so that that won't be an issue for them. But really it's about making those adjustments where, it's not people can participate without it being a prohibitor for them to do so. Be willing to examine and adjust your recruitment, your training, your onboarding, your recognition, and your communication practices and your processes, again, with the goal of creating safe places and spaces for those who may be interested in being a volunteer. My other point is to share the power, do with rather than to. And so that gets to the point that I was saying, earlier, when you're in the community, you want to create programming and opportunities that you are doing with the community rather than to the community. Really work hard to move away from transactional action and more into relational ones. So I say share the power, share voice, and share influence. And again, that can be done by making sure that these individuals are included from the start. Ask questions and listen to what people are saying so that you can learn. That is the easiest and best way to find out what people need and what they want. You have to get to a point where it's okay for people to ask questions. And for you as the director, you must also be okay with being uncomfortable to get to a comfortable place. And that's really about learning and about adjusting behavior to create that environment for everyone. So the uncomfortableness is not about, it is all about learning. And so you just want to make sure that you're okay with being in that spot because you are on a journey and you want to, again, be able to create this environment for all. So ask the right questions. Asking the right questions, I should say, I'm sorry, may be uncomfortable. It represents a sign that you are actually on the right track of creating inclusive volunteer messages and programs that meet the needs of your community. And so to aid you on your personal learning journey, have those intentional conversations that lead to heightened self-reflection and self-awareness and a better and deeper understanding of your organization and volunteer needs. So 2 areas where I want you to consider and focus on, get a pen and write this part down, is really on including others and delivering equity to others. So those 2 areas that I want you to focus on is including others and delivering equity to others. And to enact equity is to provide all people with fair opportunities to obtain their full potential. So how do you help them feel that they are, they truly belong? I believe belonging is really the gateway to higher volunteer engagement and to higher satisfaction. And so in order to get there, I think that you can just think about instances where you have felt a high sense of belonging and how that impacted your attitude and your commitment. So a little bit about what we're doing at AARP in this space. I have the privilege, as you heard, of really leading the diversity, equity, and inclusion plan within AARP. And we really have built a plan out because we seek to improve and expand the capacity of AARP's National Volunteer Network so that we can deliver more inclusive service to our colleagues, our constituents, and our communities. And so what we have done is develop out a multi-step pathway for AARP volunteers and their staff partners that will really foster cultural awareness and action planning through self-reflection, education, and facilitated conversations. And so we want, again, to help individuals along their learning journey. And so the elements of the main elements of our plan is one, we created a diversity, equity, and inclusion library that we hold in our volunteer portal. And so our volunteers have access to that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is intended to be a place of learning. The information has books, articles, podcasts, movies, just a wealth of knowledge. And so that's something that they can access as individuals, or if a team wanted to get together to say, we're going to pull this book and we're going to read it together like book club style and then have a discussion, they can do that. We also have worked on refreshing and standardizing our online orientation experience for our volunteers within our volunteer portal. And specifically, we have updated our volunteer orientation handbook because we wanted it to more fully reflect AARP's diversity, equity, and inclusion commitment. We added a statement to our volunteer application where individuals who were becoming volunteers would affirm that they understand and agree to act in accordance with AARP values. And then we reviewed and updated our Welcome to AARP video, which is a video that we use during the onboarding process. One of the larger pieces that we are working on right now is our Cultural Leadership Development Series. And it's a multi-part virtual series that has 5 90-minute leadership conversations. Each of those facilitated conversations really includes proven methods that volunteers can use to improve their understanding and their application of inclusion principles and strategies. The series, we are offering up the series to intact teams, not to individuals, because again, our primary focus is for them to work together, because we want them to be able to improve their ability to work with one another and within the communities that surround them. With the Cultural Leadership Development Series, we are also giving individuals who are who go through that process an action planning template. And that is so that they can capture their learning, so that they can use it as a self-reflection tool, and also as the team discusses the action planning and strategization that they want to do post conversations. Our 5 90-minute conversation themes are, the first one is becoming a more inclusive volunteer, and that really is our foundational conversation. It gives everybody the framework that they need for increasing how to include others. Our second is unconscious bias to unconscious equity, where our volunteers will learn a step-by-step process to really convert negative biases into positive biases, because we want to make sure that they are inclusive of all of their team members. Third is increasing volunteer trust, where our volunteers and volunteer leaders will really learn a step-by-step facilitation method where they decrease trust breakers and increase trust builders for their team. Our fourth is understanding microaggressions, and that's where our volunteers will learn the nature and the impact of microaggressions. And module number 5 focuses in on defending people with constructive feedback. So that particular module focuses in on volunteers learning a step-by-step process to defend their teams against microaggressions. We are using a workflow process and in the design and testing process for these modules. We have a focus group of 22 volunteers from across the country who review the content and the material, and then they give us feedback, and then adjustments are made based on their feedback before we repackage it for consumption to the larger country, to everyone across the country. And we are able to offer it up through a train the trainer program. So what we have done is we've developed a new volunteer team of individuals who went through a recruitment review and selection process by the Office of Volunteer Engagement. They are being trained by our external consultant, who we are working with to design our cultural leadership development series. And so that team will be the ones who are going virtually across the country when an intact team raises their hand to say that they want to go through the series. The other piece that we are offering to our volunteers are video vignettes. And those are more, I would say, on the style of TED Talks, but they really are an inventory of power-packed videos on key diversity, equity, and inclusion and related principles. And those videos, we consider those to be supplemental learning tools that complement the other products that are in our diversity, equity, and inclusion portfolio. And they too will live on our volunteer portal so that volunteers have access to them 24 hours, 7 days a week. Feedback is important to us. We are going to do that through surveys, through informal and check-ins, through post-event surveys. We do a volunteer opinion survey every single year. We will get feedback from that. We will get feedback from our Raise Your Voice tool that we have within AARP, and then regular check-ins with our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council representatives, along with our Intercultural Sounding Board. And that's a group of individuals that works with me, and they serve as my thought partner, idea generator, and reactor to all of the cultural awareness resources that the Office of Volunteer Engagement is creating and implementing across the country. So in summary, let me just give you a few things that I encourage you all to do or to remember. The first is that you don't have to be the CEO or in a leadership position at your organization to be a leader. Control your space and really inspire those around you, because your effort matters. So I want you to just think about the things that I've shared with you and really think about what you can do, because I want to encourage you to keep growing and to keep changing. And what I would like for you to do, what I want to offer up as consideration, is for you to become what I consider a champion of belonging. And you can do that by valuing diversity, by broadening inclusion, and by delivering equity. So my last thing that I will ask of you today is just, I will invite you to do this in chat, or you can continue that, you can have this conversation in your breakout rooms, but I would invite you to think about and to place in chat or later on in your breakouts what you plan to start doing, what you want to keep doing, and what you want to stop doing. And with that, I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Lisa, for sharing your insights and experience with us and giving us so many ways to apply what we're learning today. I know that all of us in the volunteer network could benefit from the new tools and resources from AARP. So thank you for sharing those with us. Due to the time, we won't be able to do a Q&A today with Dr. Ward and Ms. Simpson. We will collect questions though, and make sure that we follow up with answers. So once again, join me in thanking Dr. Ward and Ms. Simpson for joining us today and sharing so much good information on diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice, and giving us a roadmap for implementation. Thank you for spending your time with us today. I know that our program directors will have a lot to discuss in their breakout sessions. Thank you. We've come to the end of this opening part of our session today. I want to remind you that next week we will have our third exciting session with a focus on veterans and military families. We'll be joined by Mary Tobin, our AmeriCorps Seniors Advisor for Wounded Warrior, Veteran and Military Family Initiatives. And Mary will be joined by Dr. Sabrina Clark, Director of the Veteran Administration Center for Development and Civic Engagement. We will also have a brief program innovation spotlight from Choose Home, a pilot program between the VA and AmeriCorps seniors. I expect that there will be tremendous interest in all three of these presentations, and I look forward to hearing about the discussions that you will have in your breakout sessions from this week. I heard that last week they were very robust. Morgan will put a link in the chat just so that you can more easily and seamlessly go to their breakout sessions. Today, everyone will use the same link and automatically be moved into a breakout room. I will talk to you again next week. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great time conversing and connecting with your colleagues.